So why do you think that the idea of trade itself has also become contaminated with this terrible pessimism? I mean, one of the things that characterizes if it's trade that constitutes virtue, and if it's trade as well that's lifted people out of poverty, then why is it that people who engage in novel trade, entrepreneurs say, or even capitalists for that matter, why is it that that form of trade is so easily associated with so easily despised and so frequently met with contempt?
Yeah. I find it baffling because, Voltaire made the point that commerce tends to make people nicer. If two people are trading, then they suddenly stop fighting. But,
well, they're worth more to each other if they're alive then.
Well, exactly.
Then that seems to be a good thing. Like, it's a good thing to have everyone worth more alive than dead.
Right, and actually, Steve Pinker talks about this too. But the peace that breaks out at various times in human history tends to be more associated with whether countries are trading with each other than whether they happen to be democracies or any other relationship with their political systems. So it's the degree of trade really does make a difference to how peaceful things are. Well, it doesn't stop war breaking out between countries that are trading with each other, but it's no accident in the 20th century you get a period of huge protectionism that precedes the Second World War. I mean, and to some extent sparks it. Japan is saying, well, if you're not going to trade with me, I'm going to bloody well invade Asia and take stuff for myself.
I thought it was of dubious. Entering into trade with communist China was a big risk on the part of the West.
Yeah.
And when that first started to happen, it was something that, well, I was interested in and also concerned about, but mostly curious about, because on the one hand, you could say, well, why would you trade with a totalitarian state, a cruel totalitarian state, a murderous totalitarian state for that matter? But on the other hand, you could say, well, maybe it would be better off for everyone if the Chinese weren't dirt poor and starving, and if they depended on us in a mutually beneficial manner. And I would have to say that despite the fact that the Chinese Communist Party still rules with an iron fist, that it's probably been better for everyone, all concerned, that extensive trade with China has taken place. I know the North American and European working class has taken a major hit because of that, although they benefited from cheap manufactured items for sure. But you got to think a Chinese population where no one is starving and that's completely engaged in trade with the West is a more reliable long-term partner than one that's isolated and pursuing its own destiny.
Yeah, I certainly thought that until recently. I thought that our best chance of turning them into a liberal democracy was to trade with them. And after all, it was a great deal for us. We gave them, as Don Boudreaux once put it, we gave them pictures of presidents, and they gave us goods and services. In other words, money.
Yes, absolutely.
But I have to say, in the last couple of years, under Xi Jinping, China has become something very different from what it was 5 or 10 years ago, I think. And I think we are reaching the point where it is a problem that we are buying goods off a regime that is doing terrible things to Hong Kong, to the Uyghurs and others.
There's a moral quandary there, but it still seems to me even that a China that holds a substantial amount of Western debt is much less likely to upset the apple cart than a China that doesn't. It's not such a bad thing to have your destinies tangled together.
They have an interest in the dollar not collapsing, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But go back to your original question, though. Why are people so cynical and unhappy about trade and think it's such an evil thing? And I think in the end, it's that we are zero-sum thinkers.
Yeah,
we find it hard to believe that somebody isn't winning in a relationship.
And I suppose that's because crooked, foolish people do try to win.
Yeah, and for 99% of our 4 billion years of history, it was true that if someone won, it was at the expense of someone losing. But you can see very clearly in the rhetoric of Donald Trump the view that trade is a zero-sum game, is a win-lose equation. And it's quite hard, even for you and me, to get our head around the idea that actually, yes, I've driven a good bargain in buying a car or house, but maybe I've been ripped off. Who knows?
Well, I guess, okay, so part of the problem is that fair trade can revert to a crooked zero-sum game quite rapidly. And so we're on edge because of that. But I mean, people still pursue long-term relationships and they still pursue friendships. They still make the assumption that reciprocal interactions are not only possible, but also part of what makes life worth living, a really important part. And it doesn't seem that complicated to I guess it's the difficulty of extending that outward towards non-kin or even strangers. But it's a remarkable thing that that's possible. And it'd be nice if we were more grateful for it than we are.
Right. The remarkable thing about human beings is that we do treat complete strangers as honorary brothers and sisters. And how do we do that? Partly by building up these levels of trust through reciprocity over long periods.
Well, eBay is a great example of that, because when eBay first emerged, the cynics said, well, I'll put something up for sale that's junk and send it to you and it won't work and you'll send me a check that bounces and that'll be the end of eBay. And that's not what happened. Is that right off the bat, almost all the trades were fair and equitable. And then it evolved a reputation tracking system. But even before the reputation tracking system, the default transaction was precisely what it claimed to be on face value.
Our reputations are very precarious. It's very easy to lose your reputation.
Yes.
Even in quite a mobile society, it will track you down.
Well, that's even maybe more true in society now, because you can lose your reputation very easily with one misstep on Twitter.
That's certainly true.
Yes.
What's left of it?
Well, it's also interesting to see how sensitive people are to reputation maintenance, because I've watched this intently over the last 4 or 5 years. You see people who post something, for example, on Twitter, and then a small mob generates itself around them. And it might not be more than 20 people who are complaining about this particular post. And almost inevitably, the person will back down with profuse apologies and show every sign of severe emotional distress. And I suppose, I've thought about it a lot, I suppose it's akin to, in some sense, it's the electronic equivalent to having 20 neighbors show up on your doorstep. You'd assume, if you were a reasonable person, that you might have done something wrong, even though the analogy doesn't really hold true. If you're communicating with 150,000 people and you upset 15 of them, it's really difficult to say exactly what that means.